My sister's my opposite. Visually, she's totally my opposite. We look like a before and after campaign for conversion therapy. That's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. And when we were kids, I was overweight and she was underweight. We both dealt with stress with food, but opposite ends of the spectrum. And my parents actually accused me of stealing her food. Isn't that messed up? I know. It's also accurate. I was stealing her food, but the toughest part was going pants shopping because they put the biggest pair of pants at the bottom of the pile. Ugh, I hate that. I hate that. You got to flip through all the sizes of pants that you want to be to get to what you are. Brutal. You're just like, no. It's like they're forcing you to do cardio. That's what it feels like. No, man, fuck these pants. What they should do is have the biggest pair of pants in a private pile in a private room with a cookie in the pocket. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Wiker Saturday, July the 13th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. This is Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, don't think of an elephant, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 Strategies of War, and from the 10 books every conservative must read, the Federalist Papers. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
When first the sun o'er ocean glowed, and earth unveiled her virgin breast, supreme mid-nature's vast abode, was heard the Almighty's dread behest. Rise, Columbia, Columbia, brave and free, poise the globe and bound the sea. Rise, Columbia, Columbia, brave and free, poise the globe and bound the sea. Revered in arms, in peace humane, no shore nor realm shall bound thy sway, while all the virtues own thy reign, and subject elements obey. Rise, Columbia, Columbia, brave and free, bless the globe and rule the sea. Rise, Columbia, Columbia, brave and free, bless the globe and rule the sea.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Economics is haunted by more fallacies than any other study known to man. This is no accident. The inherent difficulties of the subject would be great enough in any case, but they are multiplied 1,000-fold by a factor that is insignificant in, say, physics, mathematics, or medicine. The special pleading of selfish interests. Henry Hazlitt. This may be the best explanation as to why economics seems to be so much more vulnerable to error than all the other academic disciplines. Not only is economics wrongly viewed as a data science in contemporary times, thereby losing its integral connection to human action, but economics is exponentially more susceptible to the manipulation of special interests who would bastardize it in a second for crony ends. I am sure all disciplines are subject to some degree of this, but none have quite the monetary stakes that nefarious actors would extract from the subject of economics.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Refuse to accept our premises. Refuse to go along with our reflexive indictments of everything you stand for. Refuse to tacitly accept guilt as we make our routine accusations that we know what you really mean when you talk about things like the 10th Amendment, Marxism, you lie, and date night. To us, as I think we've made perfectly clear, they all mean racism. Writing in the Weekly Standard, the brilliant essayist Nomi Emery has termed our little trick of projecting upon you what we feel in our black hearts second-hand hate. And that is what it most certainly is. And yet, like the suckers you are, you fall for it every time. You stand there and let us wail away on you, imputing every sort of ignobility to you, your culture, your belief system, your faith tradition, and your families unto the generations. By our lights, since we despise you so roundly and so thoroughly, any weapon to hand is useful. And so we club you to death with your own good manners, telling you all the while that to fight back would be wrong, would be advocating at least symbolic violence and hate-mongering, would be trying to force your opinion on us. And so you take it, when what you should do is punch us right in the face. Okay, maybe not literally, although Gaia knows we deserve it. After all, you, like everybody else in this soon-to-be great land of ours, after we finish our modern updating of Mission to Moscow, have grown up with Hollywood films. And if there's one thing you can count on, it's the arrival in the third act of what we industry types call the cheer moment. That's the part in the movie when the long-suffering hero, after having suffered indignity after insult, finally snaps and strikes back at his tormentors. Down they go in a heap of blood, spitting teeth and groping around the floor for their eyeballs, as our guy, his bloodlust finally roused, romps, stomps, and otherwise kicks some serious ass as he wipes the floor with the bad guys. And with nary a tort lawyer in sight. From High Noon to Born Losers to Straw Dogs, the cinema has made the Worm Turns revenge drama a staple of popular entertainment. We leave the theaters with our own bloodlust satiated, confident that at least in some writer's fevered imagination, righteous payback gets delivered in spades. Now, in real life, at the first punch, someone would shriek and call a lawyer, and before you knew it, our main character would be doing 6 to 12 in a medium security prison. Which actually is okay with us, since we'd then get to write the sequel, in which an unjustly imprisoned man busts out of prison, the Shawshank Redemption, or somehow returns from the dead to hunt down his tormentors, point blank, and kill them. And then you'd cheer all over again, and after the movie, ask yourselves, was there ever a time when people actually did that? Yes. It was called the American Revolution. Did they punch back? You bet your sweet patootie they did. So should you. Punch, and keep punching until we cry like little girls and run away. When we attack you, defend yourselves, by any means necessary. When you've tried this in the past, and hauled off and given us a good old-fashioned trip to the woodshed, you've had to listen to the requisite caterwauling about fringe behavior and the chin-pulling in the media, wondering whether this is the start of another Oklahoma City-type situation. And of course, if we can play the race card, you can bet we will. But we do back off. Today, we're doing our level best to criminalize your means of self-defense. Not that I'm advocating violence. Like all good liberals, I hate violence. As General Webb says to Hayward of the French in Michael Mann's dreadfully regressive The Last of the Mohicans, which celebrates a benighted time when men were men and women loved them, they have not the nature for war. Their Latinate voluptuousness combines with their Gallic laziness, and the result is, they would rather make love with their faces than fight. You simply need to find a way to relevel the playing field after we've spent half a century tilting it in our favor. Right now, as in the French and Native American War, we're waging asymmetrical warfare against you. Which, come to think of it, is another reason we can barely contain our admiration for the terrorists, who, after all, are simply doing the job we real Americans won't do, i.e., actually kill you. We know you're not lawyer savvy, that you don't come from families and social circles brimming with lawyers, that you don't routinely personally employ, as I do, at least 3 attorneys for different purposes, that calling Car Talk's resident law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe is not the first thing you think about when someone is trying to break into your home, the way we do, from the safety of our panic rooms, which come equipped with a 2-week supply of Evian water, a month's worth of raw walnuts, and satellite radio that pipes in NPR 24/7.
And that was Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the next part of Chapter 2 of Don't Think of an Elephant by Dr. Lakoff.
They started magazines and think tanks and invested billions of dollars. The first thing they did, their first victory, was getting Barry Goldwater nominated in 1964. He lost, but when he lost, they went back to the drawing board and put more money into organization. During the Vietnam War, they noticed that most of the bright young people in the country were not becoming conservatives. Conservative was a dirty word. Therefore, in 1970, Lewis Powell, just 2 months before he became a Supreme Court justice appointed by Nixon, at the time he was the chief counsel to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, wrote a memo, the Powell Memo. It was a fateful document. He said that the conservatives had to keep the country's best and brightest young people from becoming anti-business. What we need to do, Powell said, is set up institutes within the universities and outside the universities. We have to do research. We have to write books. We have to endow professorships to teach these people the right way to think. After Powell went to the Supreme Court, these ideas were taken up by William Simon, Secretary of the Treasury under Nixon. He convinced some very wealthy people and families with foundations, Coors, Scaife, Olin, to set up the Heritage Foundation, the Olin Professorships, the Olin Institute at Harvard, and other institutions. These institutes have done their job very well. People associated with them have written more books than the people on the left have on all issues. The conservatives support their intellectuals. They create media opportunities. They have media studios down the hall in their institutes so that getting on TV is easy. When the amount of research money spent by the right over a period of time is compared with the amount of media time during that period, we see a direct correlation. At present, the Koch brothers are pouring money into right-wing campaigns. This is not an accident. Conservatives, through their think tanks, figured out the importance of framing, and they figured out how to frame every issue. They figured out how to get those frames out there, how to get their people in the media all the time. They set up training institutes. The Leadership Institute in Virginia trains tens of thousands of conservatives a year and runs constant programs around the United States and in 15 foreign countries. Trained conservative spokespeople receive regular talking points and are booked by booking agencies on radio, TV, and other local venues. Conservatives figured out how to bring their people together. Every Wednesday, Grover Norquist has a group meeting, around 80 people, of leaders from the full range of the right. They are invited and they debate. They work out their differences, agree to disagree, and when they disagree, they trade off. The idea is, this week he'll win on his issue, next week I'll win on mine. Each one may not get everything he wants, but over the long haul he gets a lot of what he wants. The meetings have gone on for 2 decades. In recent years, the Wednesday morning Norquist meetings have expanded to 48 states. Via ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, conservatism has spread at the state level, allowing conservatives to take over state legislatures, gerrymander congressional districts, and take over the House of Representatives with a minority of national voter support. It is only in the wake of the 2008 Obama sweep that the radical conservative Tea Party movement has split from the previously unified conservative movement. The progressive world has not caught up. And what is worse is a set of myths believed by liberals and progressives. These myths come from a good source, but they end up hurting us badly. The myths began with the Enlightenment, and the first one goes like this. The truth will set us free. If we just tell people the facts, since people are basically rational beings, they'll all reach the right conclusions. But we know from cognitive science that people do not think like that. People think in frames. The strict father and nurturant parent frames each force a certain logic. To be accepted, the truth must fit people's frames.
And that was the next part of Chapter 2, Don't Think of an Elephant, by Dr. George Lakoff. Know Your Values and Frame the Debate, narrated by Chris Sorensen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for patriots.
American Revolution was also an offensive action, with patriots taking action to preserve their God-given rights. I don't want to conserve the left's agenda by growing government less than they would, killing fewer children than they would, and destroying marriage incrementally through civil unions instead of outright handing over the institution of marriage like they would. I want to defeat the left, not conserve it. When it's time for my generation to leave the world stage, I want us to be known as the generation that did to America's leftist progressives what Reagan did to the Soviet Union. To make that happen, we need to play offense. Offense is essential because you have to be on offense to score points, and you have to score points to win. Playing offense also boosts your side's morale while doing psychological damage to the other side. Go back to the beginning of this chapter when I talked about how mentally beaten down we are. That's purely the result of the perception the left is always on the offensive and we're always on the defensive. That's why there's so much talk about returning to the Reagan era today, because other than the early days following the 1994 Republican takeover of Congress, that really was the only time any of us can remember our side on the offensive. I think that's also one of the reasons the late Andrew Breitbart made such an impact on the conservative movement despite passing away at only 43 years old, which is an age when most men are just starting to come into their own. Breitbart played offense and went after the left, and was equipping others to do the same. The left's confidence has morphed into hubris because they're used to playing offense, and we've conditioned them to anticipate our surrender any minute now. That's why we need our people to play offense, because it really does throw them into a hissy fit when we do. A good example of this was something Kentucky Senator Rand Paul did during the summer of 2012. Yes, that Rand Paul, the one who stepped in it earlier in this book, but this time he stepped on it, or rather, them. To do Rand justice, let's quote directly from the story the liberal Huffington Post did on the example I'm citing. Quote, Senator Rand Paul moved this week to hold a non-controversial flood insurance bill hostage until the Senate agrees that life begins at fertilization. The bill, which would financially boost the national flood insurance program on the cusp of hurricane season, had been expected to pass easily in the Senate. But since Paul on Monday offered an unrelated fetal personhood amendment, which would give legal protections to fetuses from the moment of fertilization, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is threatening to halt progress on the legislation. I'm told last night that one of our Republican senators wants to offer an amendment, listen to this one, wants to offer an amendment on when life begins, Reid said on the Senate floor Tuesday. I'm not going to put up with that on flood insurance. I can be condemned by outside sources. My friends can say, let him have a vote on it. There will not be a vote on that on flood insurance. We'll either do flood insurance with the amendments that deal with flood insurance, or we won't do it. We'll have an extension. Reid has previously allowed Republicans to attach unrelated amendments to other important bills in the past few months, but Reid called Paul's measure ridiculous and outlandish and asked Republicans to deal with him on their side of the aisle. Now, that's the kind of leadership I'm talking about. Rand Paul played offense by attaching personhood, the ultimate pro-life principle in action, onto a bill that was expected to pass easily. By doing so, he would either force the Democrats to give him his vote on it or cause them to make total fools out of themselves, as Reid does in this article. like when Reed expresses incredulity that we could actually debate something as trite and insignificant in the U.S. Senate as when life begins. Given that life is one of the inalienable rights to life posited in our founding document, is there anything more important for our elected officials to be debating? I put that part of the Huffington Post story and a few other lines in bold in the book for a reason, because they're examples of how Rand Paul, by playing offense, grabbed the moral high ground and was making the left accept our premise. Note the article doesn't refer to Rand's pro-life bill as anti-reproductive freedom, but as personhood. If they're going to report accurately on the bill, even the liberal Huffington Post has to use that term because personhood isn't having an argument with anti-lifers about how many kids we're going to permit them to kill, or how we'll let them kill them, or when we'll let them kill them, after they jump through a few hoops. Maybe then they can kill the baby. No, personhood is a debate about whether or not all life is precious and sacred. Personhood is the high ground. Furthermore, Rand Paul got the Democrat Senate Majority Leader to call debating when life begins ridiculous and outlandish. Remember the 2008 presidential forum hosted at Saddleback Church when Rick Warren asked Barack Obama, at what point does an unborn baby deserve human rights? Remember.
And that was The Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese. How conservatives can win again. Actually, it should be read How Republicans Can Win Again, because, again, it's all politics. I mean, good for him, but conservatism is about culture. So with abortion, that means abortion is the political issue, promiscuity is the cultural issue. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Daily Stoic.
Peace is in staying the course. Tranquility can't be grasped except by those who have reached an unwavering and firm power of judgment. The rest constantly fall and rise in their decisions, wavering in a state of alternately rejecting and accepting things. What is the cause of this back and forth? It's because nothing is clear, and they rely on the most uncertain guide, common opinion. Seneca, Moral Letters, 95.57b through 58a. In Seneca's essay on tranquility, he uses the Greek word euthymia, which he defines as believing in yourself and trusting that you are on the right path, and not being in doubt by following the myriad footpaths of those wandering in every direction. It is this state of mind, he says, that produces tranquility. Clarity of vision allows us to have this belief. That's not to say we're always going to be 100% certain of everything, or that we even should be. Rather, it's that we can rest assured we're heading generally in the right direction, that we don't need to constantly compare ourselves with other people, or change our mind every 3 seconds based on new information. Instead, tranquility and peace are found in identifying our path and in sticking to it, staying the course, making adjustments here and there naturally, but ignoring the distracting sirens who beckon us to turn toward the rocks.
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
God never directly wills evil. Otherwise, that would make him a sinner. Whatever happens is in some sense the will of God, either actively or permissively. God loves all things in the measure that he wills them some good. He wills them at least the good of existence. So God loves a rock. God loves clouds. God loves whatever is. The fact that you and I are here with these bodies, with our intelligence, with our capacity for speech, etc. Yeah, that's God's active will. He's willed good to us. But God, we say, permits certain evils so as to bring about a greater good. So therefore, Cosad concludes, whatever is, and that, yes, includes Hitler, and that includes suffering I'm going through now, that includes illness, whatever is in some sense, at least permissively, the will of God. And therefore, I am called upon, indeed, to surrender even to those things that, at least to my experience, are nothing but evil, but I surrender to them as at least an expression of God's permissive will.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, the essence of capitalism's foreign policy is free trade, i.e. the abolition of trade barriers, of protective tariffs, of special privileges, the opening up of the world's trade routes to free international exchange and competition among the private citizens of all countries dealing directly with one another, unquote. And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day from The Roots of War, from the book Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the 33 strategies of war.
On set, the producers of Hitchcock's films often watched in bewilderment as the director moved the camera, not the actors, to stage his scenes. It seemed to make no sense, as if he loved the technical side of filmmaking more than dialogue and the human presence. Nor could editors fathom his obsession with sounds, colors, the size of the actors' heads within the frame, the speed with which people moved. He seemed to favor these endless visual details over the story itself. And then the film would be a finished product, and suddenly everything that had seemed peculiar about his method made perfect sense. Audiences often responded to Hitchcock's films more deeply than they did to the work of any other director. The images, the pacing, the camera movements swept them along and got under their skin. A Hitchcock film was not just seen, it was experienced, and it stayed in the mind long after the viewing.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Bill O'Reilly.
These other progressive things, we got to stop this now. I'm telling you, I don't have any progressive friends anymore. They're gone because I can't stomach them. Criminals running wild, murdering people because progressive DAs funded by George Soros don't want to punish the violent criminals. That's what you're giving me? You support that? Get out of my house. Out. I've had it. Biden is not going to get any better. And the Democratic Party has to get destroyed next November. I don't care whether you like Trump or not. Trump governed this nation in a responsible way where everybody prospered. And if you don't believe that, you're a moron. Every single thing, every single indicator was on positive territory. All the working people, no matter what color they were making more money and there were more jobs. We didn't have inflation. We didn't have supply problems. We didn't have any of it. Now we got all of it, in addition to an open border. These other
Anyways, he's right. This is the reason I'm playing this is because it's about time somebody said this, and it's about time he said this. He's been riding the gravy train for a long time. He's been this neutral observer and using the events of the day to write books and get rich. Now, finally, it dawns on him that if he doesn't do something, he doesn't stand up culturally, not just politically, but culturally, stand up and do something, there's not going to be any riches for him to take advantage of. Okay, and when I mean stand up culturally, he said all of his left-wing buddies and friends, all of his socialist, Democrat friends are gone. He kicked them out. Get out of the house. We all need to do that. Now, Thank you. So it's just before 4 o'clock Pacific. I don't know if it's daylight or standard time, but 4 o'clock Pacific time. And just a few minutes ago, I got the word on the radio that there had been what the way they called it was an assassination attempt. Things are still fairly fluid, but excuse me, from what was reported and what I could see on the images, there was blood on President Trump. So, and supposedly the sound of a gunshot or gunshots. So, what I'm suggesting is that if we find out that this was a gunshot, that this was indeed an assassination attempt, then we can be safe to say that it was a Democrat who tried to do this. And it occurred to me when I was thinking about this was that every single assassin in American history has been a Democrat. Who killed Lincoln? Who killed Kennedy? Who killed Martin Luther King Jr.? Who killed Robert Kennedy? And I suppose I can go on and on with other people. Oh, how about John Lennon? Who killed even John Lennon? All Democrats. So I'm saying that if we're going to have gun control in this country, what we should do is pass a law that strips every Democrat in this country of their guns. Every single one. Back in a minute. Thank you. Another thing on the Trump, about the coverage of this was their talk about whether or not this is going to lower the heat, that there's supposedly all this heat, which is, I don't know what they're talking about. It must be some kind of metaphor. They must be waxing poetic, because I don't know what they mean by heat. But supposedly there's all this heat, and so they wonder if this incident is going to lower the heat of the campaign, and it's ridiculous. What they're suggesting is that events control people, when in fact, as a matter of reality, people control events. Don't forget that. Back in a minute. Thank you. So now, 10 Books Every Conservative Must Read by Benjamin-Wiker, Ph.D., and this is Chapter 7, and it's going to be the Federalist Papers.
Chapter 7, The Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. The moment we launch into conjectures about the usurpations of the federal government, we get into an unfathomable abyss and fairly put ourselves out of the reach of all reasoning. We should confine our attention wholly to the nature and extent of the powers of the federal and state governments, as they are delineated in the Constitution. Everything beyond this must be left to the prudence and firmness of the people, who, as they will hold the scales in their own hands, it is to be hoped, will always take care to preserve the constitutional equilibrium between the general and the state governments. Recovering the Great Debate. In this and the following chapter, we are dealing with the arguments concerning the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Roughly speaking, the Federalists argued for ratification and the Anti-Federalists argued against. But while that rough distinction is accurate, it is also not very illuminating. It would be an improvement to say that the Federalists wanted a strong national government and the Anti-Federalists feared it, putting their trust instead in state and local governments. Yet it would be confusing to leave it there, because it would lead us to believe that the two sides were caught in a wholly incompatible either-or argument, either one national government or 13 state governments. What makes the debate about the Constitution so complex and enduring is that it was a both-and, not an either-or debate. Both Federalists and Anti-Federalists wanted a federal system of government. That is, a government consisting of two distinct but interrelated aspects, both a governing power that represented the union of the states and the separate governing powers of each state in that union. The disagreement, in great part, was how to set it up. The Federalists feared dissolution of the union, anarchy, and national weakness, and the remedy for them was to put enough power in the national government to avoid these ills. It also cannot be denied that the Federalists were in addition animated by the prospect of America becoming a great and powerful nation, a vision that demanded a strong and ambitious national government. The Anti-Federalists feared the tyranny and loss of local liberty and independence that goes with a powerful centralized government, and the remedy for them was to ensure that the national government, however necessary, was not made too strong. They too had their fears. They were unwilling to have fought so bloody a war against the British Crown, only to lose their local liberty and independence to an all-dominating and ambitious national government. The Anti-Federalists had their vision as well, but it was not one of national glory. It was one of freedom and independence of local communities and states. I think it is fairly accurate to say that our Constitution, along with the Bill of Rights, represents this tension between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, rather than a victory for either side. To be more accurate, it is largely a Federalist creation, and hence leans toward making the national government stronger than the states, but with safeguards. Unfortunately, those safeguards have in some respects been knocked over, and many things have occurred over the last 2 centuries, especially over the last century, that have strengthened the federal government to a point that would scare even the most devout Federalist. Many conservatives today find themselves making the very same kind of arguments made over 200 years ago by the Anti-Federalists. What a prudent conservative statesman needs to do is help us find our way back to the balance the framers of the Constitution thought they had achieved. In reconsidering our founding, we must not forget the obvious historical context of the debate. Here, etymology is instructive. The Latin word constituere means to set up. The Constitution is quite literally the setup of the government, or more specifically, the federal government. The state governments were well established long before the idea of a union. The great press for a union of the states came with the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, arising from the need for a united effort against a common enemy. The notion of a national legislative body arose with the First Continental Congress, 1774, that set out the common grievances against the British king. It grew with the Second Continental Congress, 1775, called specifically to carry out a united and effective war effort, and with the issuance of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, that confirmed the American nation as an independent national entity of free and independent states. This point cannot be overstressed. The need for a national government was born amidst the exigencies of war. The national governing body received its first official setup with the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, ratified in 1781, the year that brought the effective end to the war with the defeat and surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. The official end came with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. It took only half a dozen years for many, including the National Congress, the Congress of the Confederation, to conclude that the Articles of Confederation were sadly inadequate and needed to be reformed. Instead of carrying out a mere reform of the Articles, the famous Philadelphia Convention of 1787, driven by Federalists Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, turned the call for revision into an opportunity to draft a new constitution. This new constitution was then sent to the 13 states for ratification. The Federalist Papers, written on behalf of ratification by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, using the pseudonym Publius, began appearing in late October 1787. The last of them, number 85, is dated August 15, 1788. The Constitution was officially ratified with the affirmation of the 9th state, New Hampshire, in late June 1788. The last state to ratify the Constitution was Vermont on January 10, 1791. Largely to assuage the fears of the Anti-Federalists, the Bill of Rights, or First 10 Amendments, introduced in 1789, was ratified by the states into the Constitution by the end of 1791. Such is the end of the story. Now, let's return to the time when ratification was yet a matter of debate. The need for a strong federal government, and money to support it. Perhaps the most succinct statement of the Federalist position is uttered by Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 33. Hamilton asserts that the framers of the Constitution in the Convention foresaw what it has been a principal aim of these papers to inculcate, that the danger which most threatens our political welfare is that the state governments will finally sap the foundations of the Union. As hard as it is to believe today, the Federalists during the time of the constitutional debates feared that strong state governments would simply overwhelm the new and feeble federal power representing the Union. Something had to be done to give some substance and strength to the Union, or it would unravel, and the states would go their separate ways. The context of Hamilton's statement is a discussion of the federal power of taxation, the most important of the authorities proposed to be conferred upon the Union. Hamilton's position is quite simple. Everyone agrees a union is necessary, even the anti-federalists. That means that certain definite powers must be placed in the national government. But it is a fundamental maxim of good sense and sound policy that every power ought to be proportionate to its object. If the national government has certain defined tasks, then it must have the appropriate means to carry them out, and the most important means is money. Money is the vital principle of the body politic, as that which sustains its life and motion and enables it to perform its most essential functions. For this reason, the power of taxation is the most important of the authorities proposed to be conferred upon the Union. It is difficult to fault Hamilton in his desperate plea for sufficient funds for the Union. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress had to beg the individual states for money, and the national treasury was often embarrassingly and dangerously depleted. The Articles of Confederation did little to remedy the situation. This experience of the insufficiency of the existing federal government, as defined by the Articles of Confederation, seared into Hamilton and the Federalists the conviction that they would never again leave the general government in a kind of tutelage to the state governments, a situation that, as they learned all too painfully during war, was inconsistent with every idea of vigor or efficiency in the national government. The powers of the new federal government must be sufficient to carry out its duties, and mandated power without adequate money is a body without lifeblood. The national government cannot be in a position of having to beg from the states, a fact all too clearly understood in 1787 at the rag end of the war. "We have reached almost the last stage of national humiliation," lamented Hamilton at the 1st of December of that year. As a result of the war, the national government owes debts to foreigners and to our own citizens, and there is no proper or satisfactory way to pay them off. Are we in a condition to resent or to repel the aggression of foreign powers? No, we have neither troops, nor treasury, nor government. Public credit in these dangerous times? We seem to have abandoned its cause as desperate and irretrievable. Is commerce of importance to wealth? Ours is at the lowest point of declension. Is respectability in the eyes of foreign powers a safeguard against foreign encroachments? The imbecility of our government even forbids them to treat with us. Our ambassadors abroad are the mere pageants of mimic sovereignty, to shorten an enumeration of particulars which can afford neither pleasure nor instruction. It may in general be demanded, what indication is there of national disorder, poverty, and insignificance that could befall a community so peculiarly blessed with natural advantages as we are, which does not form a part of the dark catalogue of our public misfortunes? There can only be one remedy for providing a sufficient flow of funds to restore the health and vigor of the Union, that of permitting the national government to raise its own revenues by the ordinary methods of taxation, rather than depending on the states to supply it voluntarily. That is, the national government must be able to tax individuals directly. No merely theoretical argument about the structure of government will have any effect without providing life-giving funds to the national governing body. How much blood is enough? At this point, Hamilton steps into dangerous territory, at least from the point of the anti-federalists. Granting that a national government is necessary, and that you cannot have a national government continually begging states for a penny here and a penny there, what limit should be placed on the federal power of taxation? Hamilton argues, quite bluntly, that the federal government must of necessity be invested with an unqualified power of taxation in the ordinary modes. This he takes to be the logical result of following the maxim that the means ought to be proportioned to the end, so that in regard to taxation, there ought to be no limitation of a power destined to effect a purpose, which is itself incapable of limitation. Unlimited power of the federal government manifested in the unqualified power of taxation? The wildness of this claim is somewhat subdued if we look at the immediate context, where the concern is national defense and securing the public peace against foreign or domestic violence. It is certainly quite impossible to predict when national military threats will arise and what will be necessary in terms of funds to address them. The difficulty is that Hamilton actually draws a much larger scope for the ends of the federal government and hence the necessary funds to support it. The federal government needs the unlimited power of taxation because our wants as a nation are unlimited. If we listen to the anti-federalists who want to put a quite definite limit on the federal power of taxation, Hamilton tells the reader, one would be led to conclude that there was some known point in the economy of national affairs at which it would be safe to stop, and to say, thus far, the ends of public happiness will be promoted by supplying the wants of government, and all beyond this is unworthy of our care or anxiety. How is it possible that a government, half supplied and always necessitous, can fulfill the purposes of its institution, can provide for the security, advance the prosperity, or support the reputation of the Commonwealth? How can it ever possess either energy or stability, dignity or credit, confidence at home or respectability abroad? How can it undertake or execute any liberal or enlarged plans of public good? Certainly, the Federalists' main concern is with the national defense. But to say the very least, Hamilton has in mind a rather larger shopping list of wants. With Hamilton, we have a vision of the power and scope of national government that seems suspiciously liberal, one that foresees the need for ever enlarged plans of public good. This vision is moderated, as liberalism tends not to be, by his understanding that the Constitution supplies a rightful balance of power between the states and a limited federal government. Indeed, Hamilton dismisses the charge that he is setting the country up for an overweening federal government. The moment we launch into conjectures about the usurpation of the federal government, we get into an unfathomable abyss and fairly put ourselves out of the reach of all reasoning. There is no need to worry because the state governments, by their original constitutions, are invested with complete sovereignty. For that very reason, the real worry is actually the continuing power of the state governments, because they commonly possess most influence over the people, so that there is greater probability of encroachments by the members, i.e. the states, upon the federal head than by the federal head upon the members. Look at the actual Constitution, instructs Hamilton, where the nature and extent of the powers of state and federal governments are clearly delineated. Madison concurs. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And so, concludes Hamilton, everything beyond this must be left to the prudence and firmness of the people, who, as they will hold the scales in their own hands, it is to be hoped, will always take care to preserve the constitutional equilibrium between the general and the state governments. They must keep balanced the stability and energy of the national government with the liberty of local rule. The Constitution provides the limits, argue the Federalists. It is the burden of the people to ensure that the federal government does not transgress them. If the federal government should overpass the just bounds of its authority and make a tyrannical use of its powers, the people, whose creature it is, must appeal to the standard they have formed, warns Hamilton. and take such measures to redress the injury done to the Constitution as the exigency may suggest and prudence justify. Federal encroachments would surely result in a swift and determined reaction. The ambitious encroachments of the federal government on the authority of the state governments would cause a general alarm, and plans of resistance would be concerted by the states, adds Madison. From what we have just learned, resistance to the ambitious encroachments of the federal government should not be difficult. At least it wasn't at that time. The original national government was weak because it lacked money. Thus it would seem that to weaken a too strong federal government simply reduced the flow of tax money, and the ambitious encroachments must recede for lack of blood to nourish them. Or, to be more conservative, ensure that the blood flow is minimal all along, and the federal government will be forced to limit its ambitions. If it's that simple, how then has the federal creature become so big? Perhaps we need a short history lesson. A short history of taxation, wars, rumors of wars, and endless crises. It was the Revolutionary War that taught the Federalists the need for a strong, well-funded federal government. Wars always strengthen national power. Such national emergencies make the case for centralized authority easy and compelling, and of course taxes are needed to meet the crisis. What we have learned, however, is that once the emergency has been met, the taxes often remain in place. Government expands to imbibe them. Before the 20th century, the United States seemed to avoid this trap. Up until the Civil War, every attempt at significant direct federal taxation was quickly rebuffed or soon repealed, and excise taxes, for example on tobacco, sugar, distilled spirits, and import taxes were the main sources of federal revenue. The first federal income tax was passed with the Revenue Act of 1861 to pay for the extremely costly Civil War, but happily it was abolished in 1872, and the federal government had to live on excise taxes again, supplemented by tariffs. In 1913, however, with the passage of the 16th Amendment, Congress was empowered to lay and collect taxes on income from whatever sources derived, and World War I caused this power to be put to immediate use. Federal income taxes started their long and continual expansion. Taxes were lowered during the boom years of the 1920s, but were raised again during the economic crisis of the Great Depression. The Social Security Act of 1935 contrived a new method of taxation, and the welfare state was born with it. This set in stone a fundamental dependence of the people directly on the federal government, and people who depend on federal power are exceedingly unlikely to resist or rebel against its ambitious encroachments for enlarged plans of public good. World War II expanded national power even further, and a method of painless taxation was devised, income tax withholding. In the name of efficiency, it helped make the people less vigilant about the government's confiscatory tax power. Even more ominous, the people began seeing themselves not as jealous guardians of their own liberty, but as beneficiaries of government programs, not just Social Security, but Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs, all of which required more taxation. The Reagan-era Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 and Tax Reform Act of 1986 tried to reverse the ever-increasing bloat of direct federal taxation. The Clinton administration tried to make a reverse of the reverse, raising the taxes on upper income levels. The Bush administration tried to constrict the tax flow once again, but Bush's domestic fiscal policies and 2 wars drove America into extreme debt, which exploded into an economic crisis that the Obama administration has used to justify a massive expansion of government spending and a doubling of the money supply in less than a year. The lesson seems fairly obvious. It is the government's increased powers of taxation that have allowed it to grow, expansions that Alexander Hamilton justified in theory, though he might not have justified the particulars in practice. The Federalist Plan for inflating the national government. Soft despotism? The fact is, the blueprint for expanding federal power was given in the Federalist itself. Again, the context is important. At the time of the Revolution, the state governments were indeed well established and more powerful than the feeble, fledgling federal government. The problem, as the Federalists saw it, was how the federal government could gain any power at all. To be more exact and profound, the Federalists believed that their bid for a stronger central government was working against human nature. Local politics come first because our affection, our love, is first of all local. Our family, our town, our city. That is why, argue both Hamilton and Madison, we don't have to worry about the development of a strong national government. In Hamilton's words, "It is a known fact in human nature that its affections are commonly weak in proportion to the distance or diffusiveness of the object. Upon the same principle that a man is more attached to his family than to his neighborhood than to the community at large, the people of each state would be apt to feel a stronger bias towards their local governments than towards the government of the Union, unless the force of that principle should be destroyed by a much better administration of the latter." That is a big unless, a key to what could reverse the natural conservative emphasis on the local over the national. Hamilton even outlined a strategy for attaching people to the national government. The government of the Union, like that of each state, must be able to address itself immediately to the hopes and fears of individuals, and to attract to its support those passions which have the strongest influence upon the human heart. This meant that federal laws should not just be directed to the states. Rather, we must extend the laws of the federal government to the individual citizens of America. Extending the laws of the federal government directly and deeply into the intimate lives of individual citizens fostered affection for and dependence on the national government, even at the expense of state and local governments. Hamilton continues, "The more the operations of the national authority are intermingled in the ordinary exercise of government, the more the citizens are accustomed to meet with it in the common occurrences of their political life, the more it is familiarized to their sight and to their feelings, the further it enters into those objects which touch the most sensible chords and put in motion the most active springs of the human heart, the greater will be the probability that it will conciliate the respect and attachment of the community. A government continually at a distance and out of sight can hardly be expected to interest the sensations of the people. The inference is that the authority of the Union and the affections of the citizens toward it will be strengthened rather than weakened by its extension to what are called matters of internal concern, and that it will have less occasion to recur to force in proportion to the familiarity and comprehensiveness of its agency. The more it circulates through those channels and currents in which the passions of mankind naturally flow, the less it will require the aid of the violent and perilous expedients of compulsion." It is important that this insight is offered to placate anti-federalist fears that the national government shall constantly need to use military force to compel citizens, against their nature, to obey a distant national government over their state and local governments. Hamilton ingeniously suggests that greater dependence of individuals on the national government will make the need for force all but unnecessary. And he was right. That is the genius of the welfare state. It literally supplants all local affections, all natural ties, and replaces them with a national big brother or nanny state. The duties of a husband and father are taken over by the welfare state, which provides child support. The duties of a wife and mother are taken over through state-supported daycare. The individual depends directly on the national government, rather than on the family and neighborhood. About a half-century later, Tocqueville described this relationship as soft despotism, a despotism more extensive and milder than occurred in ancient tyrannies, one that would degrade men without tormenting them. Tocqueville saw the possibility of soft despotism as a result of our character more than our constitution, more the result of our passion for equality and our envy, our passion for immediate material gratification, our devotion to self-interest at the expense of virtue, and our impatience at getting what we desire. All these things, warned Tocqueville, could lead us, step by willing step, into the gentle hands of a soft but despotic federal government. Tocqueville's powers of prophecy in trying to imagine the new features of this despotism are chillingly accurate. Tocqueville envisioned that an immense tutelary power is elevated above the people, which alone takes charge of assuring their enjoyments and watching over their fate. It is absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. It would resemble paternal power if, like that, it had for its object to prepare men for manhood. But on the contrary, it seeks only to keep them fixed irrevocably in childhood. It likes citizens to enjoy themselves, provided that they think only of enjoying themselves. It willingly works for their happiness, but it wants to be the unique agent and sole arbiter of that. It provides for their security, foresees and secures their needs, facilitates their pleasures, conducts their principal affairs, directs their industry, regulates their estates, divides their inheritances. Can it not take away from them entirely the trouble of thinking and the pain of living? So it is that every day it renders the employment of free will less useful and more rare. It confines the action of the will in a smaller space, and little by little steals the very use of free will from each citizen. Equality has prepared men for all these things. It has disposed them to tolerate them, and often even to regard them as a benefit. Thus, after taking each individual by turns in its powerful hands and kneading him as it likes, the sovereign extends its arms over society as a whole. It covers its surface with a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules through which the most original minds and the most vigorous souls cannot clear a way to surpass the crowd. It does not break wills, but it softens them, bends them, and directs them. It rarely forces one to act, but it constantly opposes itself to one's acting. It does not destroy, it prevents things from being born. It does not tyrannize, it hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to being nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. Timid and industrious animals, the ultimate men without chests. Hamilton would no doubt have cringed at this outcome, but he lacked Tocqueville's prophetic powers to see its likelihood. With the other Federalists, Hamilton thought the Constitution had sufficient safeguards against an excessive concentration of power in the federal government, and he also warned the people that, ultimately, they must be vigilant. Again, we must remember the context. The Federalists were trying to strengthen a very weak, very new federal government against well-established state governments. And even in strengthening the federal government, the Federalists were careful to insert additional checks on federal power. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The Federalists attempted to ward off the danger of centralized power by pitting the national government against itself. Our celebrated division of powers, the separation of the federal government into three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial, was designed to act as a constant check on the aspirations of any person or group that attempted to take tyrannical control of the national government. Rather than setting up a constitution that allows all power to flow into one pool, the genius of the Federalists, working upon the arguments of Montesquieu, was to set the separate powers in a kind of perpetual antagonism. It is a great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department, if each such department, the President, Congress, and the judiciary, have both the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. The dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control of government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. The Federalists considered the legislative branch to be the most likely place for power to concentrate. So, in regard to Congress itself, the ambitions to power were further checked by dividing the legislature into different branches, the House and the Senate, and rendering them by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little concerned with each other as possible. Thus, rather than having an efficient, vigorous, wholly united federal government, one that could use its great energy in a united effort for good, the Federalists envisioned the three branches as three giants tied together at odd angles by tight ropes, a step forward by one causing a painful pinch and a reaction by the other two. The Federalists were willing to sacrifice significant energy and efficiency because they realized an important conservative principle. Among mere human beings, power is ambiguous. The power to do great good is also the power to do great evil. Since human beings are inclined toward wickedness, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, we would be safer hamstringing federal power. One of the key differences between conservatism and liberalism emerges precisely here. Despite what some conservatives might think, liberals want to do great good, and they realize that great power is necessary to do it. As secularists, they have largely discarded any notion of human sin as a pervasive toxin in every human heart. Certain classes of people may be corrupt, but there is no fundamental corruption plaguing man. All that is needed to fix our problems is power, which they assume they can wield with unambiguous goodness. For this reason, liberals chafe at the federal checks and balances, and incline to methods of political change that disregard them, such as using the judiciary as a legislative power to make laws, or allowing the president to have special czars and make endless use of executive agencies not accountable through elections to the people, or bypassing protective legislative procedures to ram through favored programs. If the president and the judiciary both take upon themselves the power to make laws, then we no longer have a division of power, but all three branches expressing the same power. Happily, the dependence on the people is still the primary control of government, and conservatives, at least, can see the wisdom of the further check against tyranny of the federal government in the Constitution, the election of a third of the senators and of all the representatives every 2 years. Yet, it seems that mere procedural checks and balances are not enough. If our character is bad, then no formal institutions, no formal mechanisms can save us from contriving our own self-destruction as a nation. Without virtue, no clever balancing of powers can thwart the passions that have so regularly led to the inner collapse of great nations. The importance of virtue, of character, brings us to our last topic, the nature of the American Republic as understood by the Federalists. The American Republic? We recall from Aristotle the important distinction between good and bad political regimes, and hence the important distinction between a republic and a democracy, where a republic was rule of the many directed toward the true good as defined by virtue, and democracy was rule of the many directed toward their own satisfactions. Both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed that Americans should be a republic, but they had important disagreements about what that meant. The Federalists argued for a new, expanded definition of a republic, one big enough to fit a large nation consisting of distinct sovereign states. The Anti-Federalists held to the older notion of republic, that a true republic, defined by virtue and familial and local affection, could only exist on a smaller scale. The Anti-Federalists believed that the state defined the largest possible limit of a republic, and that the Union should be considered a union of sovereign republics. Hence the importance in the Constitution of Article 4, Section 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government. For the Anti-Federalists, once a government reaches beyond a particular size, it must necessarily be despotic in order to rule effectively over so large a territory. The Federalists understood the Anti-Federalist position well and attempted to answer it. For better or worse, they answered it by redefining what republic meant. Madison argued that the Union was a confederacy founded on Republican principles and composed of Republican members. For this reason, a superintending government was necessary, one that possessed both authority and power to defend the system against aristocratic or monarchical innovations. To shore up against the congealing of an American aristocracy, the Constitution demanded that no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. Article 1, Section 9. Here, a republic is contrasted with kingship and aristocracy, the latter two undesirable because of their tendency to degrade into their respective bad forms, tyranny and oligarchy. By contrast with the rule of the one or few, republican government requires that the sense of the majority should prevail. But sense of the majority does not mean democratic rule. The Federalists did not want majority rule to degrade the government from a republic into a kind of majority dictatorship. Virtue and the true common good still had to define the government. What the Federalists proposed was a kind of national republic over the several state republics, each with its own proper domain. The general government is not to be charged with the whole power of making and administering laws, Madison noted. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated objects, which concern all the members of the republic, but which cannot be attained by the separate provisions of any. Simply put, the national republican government is charged with the task of doing those things, and only those things, that state governments cannot, such as regulating commerce between states, maintaining and directing a national military defense, minting a common coin to be used by all states. The state republics do not have the power left over from the national government. The state republics remain the primary political sphere. True to conservative principles, politics is built from the ground up: family, village, county, state. And then, when the state republic has reached its limit, the federal republic does what the individual states cannot. In this way, republican government, as it has been understood, a small regime based in virtue and ordered to the true common good, was retained. Each state was a republic, and the national government both respected and protected their republican nature and sovereignty. Yet how could the national government be considered a republic? By a rather adroit expansion, even redefinition, of what republic meant, creating a so-called extended republic. Madison contrasts a republic with a democracy, not in the sense in which Aristotle did, but in regard to the question of representation. In a democracy, the people meet and exercise the government in person. In a republic, they assemble and administer it by their representatives and agents. A democracy, consequently, must be confined to a small spot. A republic may be extended over a large region. A system of representation allows us to get around a problem with democracy where individuals directly participate in government, voting on laws and deciding matters of policy themselves. That may work on a small scale of a village or county, but is entirely impractical either on the state or national scale. Having the people vote for representatives, who in turn vote directly on laws and decide matters of policy, gets around this difficulty. That allows for self-government by the people, although mediated through elected representatives. Thus, the National Representative Republic satisfies the definition of a republic. It is not rule of the one, either a monarch or a tyrant. It is not rule of the few, be they aristocrats or oligarchs. It is the rule of the many through representation. Of course, none of the states were democracies, and all had some system of representation, and so fit, more or less, the new definition of a republic as well. But the original distinction between a republic and a democracy is made in regard to what each rules for, the true good or mere private interest. Madison addresses this as well, calling the rule of the many for their own interest not democratic rule, but rule by faction. A faction, explains Madison, is a number of citizens, united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of the other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. The number can even be a minority rather than a majority, because in gaining political power, they can act with the force of the majority. The way to control such factions arising and gaining power is not to abolish liberty simply because it nourishes faction, but to control its effects. The federal system of Republican representation controls its effects by passing majority rule through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Since on the national level this is done with the good of the entire Union in mind, local or even statewide factions will be unable to form against the interests of all states. Indeed, the national government will be more likely than the state republics to attract representatives with enlightened views and virtuous sentiments that render them superior to local prejudices and to schemes of injustice. The Federalist vision of a government imbued with virtue was contested, as we'll see, by the Anti-Federalists. They were extremely skeptical that national representative bodies were more likely to contain men of greater virtue, and they thought that the temptations to national power in the Constitution were insufficiently checked. To their side of the debate, we now turn.
And that was the Federalist Papers from the 10 books every conservative must read, plus 4 not to miss and 1 imposter by Benjamin-Wiker, Ph.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.